The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we will be speaking with Ambassador Robert Hunter. He has an impressive public service record and has served in multiple presidential administrations. He was Clinton's ambassador to NATO and on Carter's National Security Council. He is a prolific writer as well. Ambassador Hunter, welcome to the program from Washington.
Well, thank you very much. First, let me compliment you, Doug, and Michael for the tremendous work that you do down at Troy University. Being off the East Coast, you folks have a chance to do real thinking and do extraordinary things for our country, and it's an honor to be with you once again.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Hunter, it is truly an honor for both of us. I'd like to open the question or open the show by asking you a question about Carter's National Security Council. So you were on President Carter's National Security Council and were one of the principal architects of the Carter Doctrine along with Robert Ames. What was your role in this important doctrine?
Well, the Iranian hostage crisis was going on, and that was being managed mostly by my deputy, Navy Captain Gary Sick. So I figured out we needed to have some larger framework for this. So I got a small rump group together with, you already mentioned Robert Ames, who was unfortunately blown up in Beirut a few years later, and representatives from state and defense, both military and civilian. And we figured out we needed to have a doctrine. So I wrote up what it is, and I sent it into Brzezinski. Brzezinski took it to the president, and the president said, I like this, and I'm going to make this the centerpiece of the 1980, I guess it was, State of the Union address. And he then proclaimed the Carter Doctrine, which had a remarkable quality to it. It was after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We were worried they might also go to Iran. So here were the Iranians holding Americans hostage. And here the United States was saying, if Russia invades Iran, it's not what the words said, but what they meant, we will actually defend Iran. Remarkable.
That is actually remarkable. You served as ambassador to NATO during an important time during the Clinton administration, and you were able to provide leadership for NATO's intervention in Bosnia. What did you do during this time, and what was the secret for your success?
Well, I'll let other people decide whether I was a success or not. And there really wasn't much secret to it, because we understood in my mission at NATO, working with some of the really high quality American military leaders, that nothing was going to happen in Bosnia unless NATO were able to use air power against the offending parties, in this case, the Bosnian Serbs and at some point some of the Croatian from Bosnia. So eventually we got that done, triggered after the Srebrenica disaster, the slaughter of people, 8,000 people in Srebrenica in the late summer of 1995. But the real secret was that we had redone NATO for the future, which has several elements. Keep America as a European power, preserve Allied command Europe, keep the German problem solved, take Central Europe off the geopolitical chessboard, which had been the proximate cause of the First and Second World War and even the Cold War, reach out to Russia to include it, which was a proposal of George H.W. Bush when he talked about a Europe-whole trade, and then find a place for Ukraine, not as a member of NATO, but as a country that was still going to be within the penumbra of NATO security. Now, these involved partnership for peace, and then the taking in of a few new countries into NATO, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, which had the added element, which was accepted actually by the Russians, that they surrounded Germany. The same as having united Germany in NATO, which was to reassure everybody, and that was basically the Russians and the French, that the Germans would not get out of control again. The person who thought that up was the German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl. He understood that Germany, to be a useful, accepted power, it had to be proof against a bad future. So once we got all of that done, it was clear that none of that would work if you had the worst fighting in Europe going on at the same time, worst fighting since World War II. And that finally led all the allies, particularly the British, to agree that NATO could use air power in Bosnia. And in 18 days, after 2 terrible years, in 18 days, the war came to a halt.
Ambassador Hunter, recently you wrote a chapter in a book called American Global Leadership. And I would like to turn to your chapter specifically and ask, what are the major challenges that America faces going forward, especially diplomatically?
Well, first, I recommend that everybody buy this book and read it. It's got some extraordinarily able people with an awful lot of experience and a lot of insight in it. I just happen to be one of, I guess, 14 people writing in it. I would say the most important challenge to the United States is going to be what I call strategic thinking, which is to have people, not just in government, but in the think tanks, of which Troy is one of the good guys in this business, and in the American media, which sometimes is not such good guys when it comes to dealing with these things, thinking strategically. The United States no longer has the same power and influence that we had in the Cold War. Other countries have been coming up, but we're still number one, to use that expression. And thinking strategically, what is most important for the United States? What is the most important for the world? And how do we figure out a way to get there in a sense that might actually work? Now, that starts with, it sound maybe peculiar, a knowledge of history of the United States, a history of international relations, and the history of all countries that we're dealing with. You can't deal with another country effectively, friend or foe, unless you've walked a mile in their shoes, namely to understand their history, their culture, their perspective. Unfortunately, I have to say, for quite some time now, we have not had in the highest reaches of the United States government people with these capabilities. If we're going to cope, we have to bring them back into government. The think tanks have to pull up their socks and do the post-Cold War thinking that so far really hasn't taken place.
Ambassador Hunter, I'm going to turn now to the war in Ukraine and ask, how has the war impacted American diplomacy and Washington's international prowess?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
How has the war in Ukraine impacted American diplomacy and our international standing?
Right now, the most important challenge to the Western world, and frankly maybe the world in general, is the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression, which had 2 phases, 2014 when they went into Crimea and Donbass, and then 2022 in which they tried to take over all of Ukraine. Part of the reason that happened was not only Mr. Putin with his ambitions, but also because in the West, particularly in the United States, we failed to follow one of George H.W. Bush's primary objectives, which was to make sure that Russia was not punished after the Cold War, the way Germany was punished in 1919 in the Treaty of Versailles, which Hitler went to town on and helped bring Hitler to power. So what we have learned now is a couple of things. One, the United States has to be directly and fully and finally engaged, because no country can deal with Russia except the United States. Others can help, but unless we're in there, it's not going to work at all. Secondly, and here I think President Biden got it exactly right, we want to show that Russia cannot prevail militarily, and hence we provide an awful lot of support along with allies to the Ukrainian forces, but not so much as to take the war back into Russia beyond some limited strikes against logistic bases and that sort of thing, such that this might, by accident, probably by accident, escalate into a wider European war. That's the number one challenge we face right now. It requires very careful work day by day, and I have to say Mr. Biden has done a pretty good job on that. But it can continue with this. But there has to be one basic understanding that at some point, Russia is going to be a major power. We cannot get around that. It's us, it's the Europeans, it's the Russians and the Chinese, and nobody else really matters. But if we decide we're going to have a permanent confrontation with Russia, and they decide the same, we're going to have a new Cold War with risks, costs, longevity, diversion of attention, and that's in nobody's interest, which means the next step needs to be, with Ukraine, negotiations involving Ukraine, involving Russia, involving the United States. Is it possible? I have no idea. The decisions have to be made in Washington and in the mind of Vladimir Putin. But negotiations are the only way to go, and that is going to involve Ukrainian sovereignty over its territory, but acceptance of a major role for Russian speakers and people with a Russian background. Can it be done? I have no idea. But the blueprint is there to be worked on.
Ambassador Hunter, I'd like to turn to technology and the increasing impact of technology just in day-to-day lives. How does technology and having more and greater electronic connection lead to better policy, if at all?
A difficult question to answer because we're only just beginning into the area of AI. I hate that term. I hate the whole concept, but that's another matter. Really, it's not so much the technology, which is a tool, it's what goes on in people's brains to use the technology effectively. Obviously, weapons have become much more capable, is that the right word? With the drone being the most important development there. The capacity of the militaries to talk with one another, to send messages back and forth. Napoleon used to have to write instructions out on a piece of paper and give it to a guy on horseback. Now it's done instantly through a classified internet. But it's really brain power, the most important thing, and use the tools effectively. And that also adds to the problems of keeping control, to prevent accidents, of not doing things that are by accident going to lead to a major war. The precedent there, of course, is August 1914, First World War, where a war started accidentally and became, up to that point, the worst war in human history.
Ambassador Hunter, you served in the LBJ and Carter administrations, and you were an advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy. How did your understanding of America's place in the world grow and deepen over time? And what did you learn from the people that you served?
Well, the first thing on this one has to understand is that if you can't, in a foreign policy, get the broad support of the American people, you don't have a foreign policy. We are a country of interest, but also a country of values. And there sometimes is a tension between the two. What we feel we leaders and others feel we might need to do for our interests in the world, and how does that relate to the things we care about, democracy, human rights, and the like. And they need to be brought together and communicated in an interactive way with the people of the United States. That begins with the Congress of the United States, which I'm old enough to remember when there was true bipartisanship, and now bipartisanship is more or less collapsed. In part, that has to do with money in politics. It has to be the invidious role of the mainstream media. If it bleeds, it leads. But one thing I learned, and I was deeply fortunate to work in the Johnson administration on education, and then for Ted Kennedy, one of the truly great senators in American history, and for Hubert Humphrey, who was if you take Humphrey and Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, put them together, plus with Jimmy Carter and Lyndon Johnson, except for the tragedy of Vietnam. And there's no limit to what we, the United States, can do. But if you do not engage the people of the United States and listen to them, you do not have a foreign policy.
I'd like to quickly turn towards NATO. We talked about your time as ambassador to NATO, and you were in NATO at a critical time and helped the Atlantic Alliance expand. How do you assess NATO's expansion given so many years since the first expansion? And did expansion benefit the alliance in the way that it was intended?
Well, I think past the first three countries of Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, which was instrumental not only to help stabilize Central Europe, but also to reassure everybody about Germany, as I've already mentioned. It may sound like a distant memory. And with the exception of the three Baltic states, which are not Slavic states, which were only in the Soviet Union because of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, I think NATO enlargement should have stopped right there. The problem is that there are the virtue is there are instruments like Partnership for Peace, the European Union, individual relationships, the private sector, etc., to bring these countries in Central Europe fully into the West. But as soon as you start enlarging beyond that, you do encroach on what Russia has a legitimate concern about being surrounded by NATO. And the worst moment in all of this was in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. For reasons I don't have time to explain, NATO ended up saying that Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO. That was absolutely stupid, because that was way over the line for what Russia could tolerate, just as, though with changes, in 1962, we could not accept the Soviet Union and Cuba. I mean, there are just certain kinds of things that you have to understand of countries' interests. Now, Ukraine not being in the Russian sphere of influence, full stop, but also not being a member of NATO right up against the Russian frontier. We've continued to say that, and I think that is dumb. The second point is, and this is why some of this is bizarre, to join NATO, like any other NATO decision, requires absolute unanimity. Everything that NATO does, everything has to be done by consensus of the now 32 countries, because that gives you strength, But there is no way that Ukraine, and of course Georgia and other countries, will ever get a consensus to join NATO, which includes the fundamental proposition that if any of them are aggressed against, we collectively all go to war against the aggressor. How we do it's up to national decision, but we accept that we're at war. And of the 32, I can name 7 or 8 or 9 who would just say, with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Georgia, maybe some other countries, we're just not going to do it. So this is kind of a self-inflicted wound, which we are going to repeat again at the NATO summit here in Washington, commemorating, I guess, its 75th year in July. But that is inhibiting being able to get the Ukraine issue negotiated. And of course, the Russians have to live up to their commitments. In 1994, when Ukraine and 3 other countries gave up nuclear weapons, Russia joined the United States and Britain, with China and France also supporting the absolute integrity of Ukrainian security. Russia broke that. Putin broke that and is in violation. One thing that has to happen is he has to go back to the Russian commitments. Otherwise, who's going to trust them for anything?
Ambassador Hunter, I'm going to change the focus slightly and ask you to relate an interesting personal story regarding the Watergate break-in and the downfall of Nixon. Would you share that story?
I'm sorry, what is that?
You have a very interesting personal story regarding Watergate. Would you mind telling that?
I caused Watergate. There you go. I was, at the time, which was June the 17th, 1972, I was working for the Democratic National Committee on the platform for that year's National Convention in the Watergate Hotel, 5th floor. That's the office building. That's where the Democratic National Committee operated. And it was a Friday night, and I was going to pull an all-nighter because I had to get a lot of stuff together for the hearings and all that stuff. And so I was in there at about 7 o'clock at night, 6:45, and I get a phone call from a friend up in Canada who said, come on up for the weekend. I said, I can't, I've got to pull an all-nighter. Oh, come on. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll go out to National Airport. If I can get on the last plane, I'll do that. Otherwise, I'll come back here and work all night. So I went out, drove madly out to National Airport. Sure enough, they had closed the door of the plane, but they opened it up for me, got in the plane, and I went up to Canada. Otherwise, I would have been sitting in my office right across from the Howard Johnson, where the lookout was, looking into this large open office area, and they would have seen a light on at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they wouldn't have come in. So what happened, there was no light on. The burglars came into the basement. They'd already taped open a door in the garage, and the guard came in and happened to see the door taped open. Said, there's something wrong here, and he called the cops. And so the 5 burglars were caught at the DNC, but if I had been there, they would have broken in another night, and maybe they wouldn't have gotten caught, and Richard Nixon would still be president of the United States. So that's how I caused Watergate. A little sidebar, when the cops came in, I'm a messy guy, ask my wife, and over in the corner of this big open plan office, I had a desk and I'd thrown everything on the floor, and it was a wreck, just the papers working on. And one of the things he's got is, so Monday morning when we were all in there with the looking at the mug shots and everything in a team meeting of the DNC people, and the guy had been called in from the DNC to look at this, to join the cops at 4:30 in the morning, and he said, one of the things that the cops said, you can see that they've been ransacking the place, looking over at where I was. And he said, I knew, however, that was Hunter's space. So I said, gentlemen, I'm not quite so sure that they've been ransacking the place. So that was one charge that got dropped. So that's my story. I caused Watergate. And that's it. Oh, there you go.
That's a fantastic story. Ambassador Hunter, I'd like to turn back to ask your expert opinion here for a second. Do you think that the United States is well equipped to respond to the global challenges that it faces currently? The rise of China, instability in Europe and the Middle East as well?
Well, the first thing is what we do at home. And that is the strength of the American political system, which now is under question. I'm not saying, like a lot of people, that democracy is going to disappear tomorrow, depending on how the election comes out. But we have an awful lot of work to do here. And that includes all four branches of government, which is the executive, the Supreme Court, which right now is, I think, dysfunctional, the Congress, which is dysfunctional, and the fourth branch, which is the media, which very few outlets really tell it as it is because they're interested in selling stories. In fact, the Trump phenomenon, and I have to be direct on that, has a lot to do with his being built up by the media back before 2016, and he knew how to manipulate, still does know how to manipulate the media. Every little thing that happens with Trump, every little terrible thing he says becomes front page television news, whereas the worst thing that could happen to Trump would be cut him off for a couple of weeks, cut him off from the oxygen in the media. But that's not going to happen. So number one is that. Number two, and that includes the future of the United States, education, particularly in history and civics. The so-called STEM things that we're learning for kids nowadays is great. But if you don't teach them the history of the United States and civics about governance and how difficult it is, but how important it is, we don't have a leg to stand on. Then the strength of the American economy, obviously, and which is getting better and better, particularly with the private sector as well as the public sector. On top of that, it's understanding with brain power how the world is now put together, what we can do, what we can't do, and to come up with modes of cooperation that can be effective, and also confrontation where necessary. As I've already said, we cannot rule out a future role for Russia, and it's ruled itself out right now, but for the future it's going to be there. We have to avoid a Cold War with China. In fact, the chances of having a fundamental confrontation with China, if they're smart and if we're smart, are actually pretty low. In Europe, we've always had confrontation, the two world wars and the Cold War, on land. Whereas you have in Asia, the only places where we and China interact in land is maybe a North Korean border there, where China actually shares our interest in containing the Kim family in North Korea, and then some in Southeast Asia. We've got the problems of the islands and all that, but it's basically something that is at sea where you can back off if you want to. We can find a way to cope with, deal with, interact with China if we both understand a confrontation between the two of our countries is damaging to both of our countries. Now, we have a lot of talented people. We need to bring them into government, bring them into think tanks, and send them all to Troy University for a refresher course. Because, as I've said before, you guys are not in Washington, so you have freedom to think out loud.
Ambassador Hunter, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for being a part of our program and for sharing your stories with us.
It's been mine, and what you're doing at Troy University is part of the solution to what ails the United States, not part of the problem. Godspeed.
Thank you.